Origins of Babylon, Episode 6. What is Babylon in the Bible? Full system explained. Chapter 1. The question. Babylon is not a place, and it never was. That's the first thing that has to be understood. Because most people, when they hear the word Babylon, immediately think of something ancient, a city, an empire, something buried in history, something that existed and then disappeared. They picture ruins, monuments, something distant, something disconnected from their present reality. And because of that, they assume Babylon is over, finished, something that no longer has anything to do with the world they're living in now. But when you actually read scripture carefully, that understanding begins to break. Because Babylon is not described as something that simply ends. It doesn't disappear. It changes. What once looked like a city becomes something much harder to recognize. Scripture begins to describe something that is not confined to geography, not limited to a specific time, and not removed from the present world. Instead, it reveals something that continues, something that evolves, something that exists all the way to the end. And that's where most people miss it, because they're looking for something that looks like the past, while the system has already changed its form. And part of what makes it difficult to recognize is not just that it changes, but how it changes. It becomes more refined, less visible, more embedded into the way people live, the way they think, the way they understand the world around them. So what people expect to see, they don't see, and what they are actually living inside of, they don't recognize, which means the question itself has to change. It is no longer enough to ask, what was Babylon? Because that question keeps you looking backward. The real question is, what is Babylon right now? Chapter 2. A misunderstood kingdom. Most people have been taught to think of Babylon as history, an ancient civilization, a kingdom that rose, played its role, and then disappeared. It becomes something you read about, but not something you expect to encounter. And because of that, it is easy to believe that whatever Babylon was, it no longer exists. But when you begin to read scripture carefully, that idea starts to break. Because the prophets do not speak about Babylon as something that simply ended. They speak about it as something that continues. They reference it beyond its original form, beyond its physical location, beyond the moment when the city itself fell. And that creates a problem for the way most people understand it. Because if Babylon were only a place, then once that place was destroyed, the story would be finished. But the story does not end. The language continues. The warnings continue. The pattern continues. And that means something important. What is being described is not only a kingdom, it is a structure, something that can exist in different forms, in different systems, in different times. And the more it develops, the less it looks like what people expect. This is why it becomes difficult to recognize, because people are looking for something that looks like the past, while the system has already changed its appearance. So instead of asking, where is Babylon? You have to begin asking a different question. What carries the same structure, even if it no longer looks the same? Because once you ask that question, you stop looking for a place, and you start looking for a pattern. Chapter 3. The nature of Babylon. Babylon is a system. That statement is simple, but it changes everything once you actually understand what it means. Because most people are not looking for a system, they are looking for a place, something they can point to, something they can locate, something they can say exists somewhere outside of their own life. But Babylon does not work that way. It is not limited to geography. It is not confined to a single nation. It is not tied to one moment in history. It is a structure that organizes people, a structure that governs behavior, a structure that shapes how reality is understood without requiring relationship with the Most High. And that last part is what makes it different. Because what Babylon builds, it builds in place of that relationship. It provides order without obedience. It provides direction without covenant. It provides identity without truth, and because of that, people can live inside of it without ever realizing what they are living under. This is why Babylon cannot be reduced to politics alone. It is not just laws. It is not just leaders. It is not just governments. It is also how people think. It is how they interpret what they see. It is how they define what is normal, what is acceptable, what is necessary. It operates in layers. It builds itself into belief, into perception, into dependence, until it is no longer something people interact with. It becomes something they live within. So Babylon is not where you go. It is what you live under. And once that begins to settle in, something shifts, because now you are no longer looking for Babylon somewhere else. You begin to ask a different question. What structure is shaping everything around me right now? And that is where recognition begins. Because once something is embedded deeply enough, it does not feel like control. It feels like order. It feels like progress. It feels like the way things are supposed to work. And when something feels necessary, it is rarely questioned. That is the nature of Babylon. Not obvious control, but accepted structure. Chapter 4. The beginning of the system. To understand Babylon, you have to go back to where the system begins, not where it becomes powerful, but where it first appears. In Genesis, a figure is introduced. Nimrod. He is described as a mighty one in the earth, a mighty hunter before the Most High. And at first glance, that description can seem simple, but it is not, because this is not describing someone chasing animals. This is describing influence, authority, control. This is describing a man who begins to gather people under himself, and that is the shift. Because up to this point, order was meant to come through relationship with the Most High, through covenant, through obedience, but now something different appears. Authority that does not come from above, but is established from below. Authority that organizes people, without directing them back to the Most High. Nimrod represents the beginning of centralized power, not just leadership, but structured control, a system where people are gathered, directed, aligned, not through covenant, but through authority. And that changes everything, because once authority is established this way, it does not remain neutral. It begins to expand. It begins to define. It begins to position itself in a place that does not belong to man. This is why Babylon is not just about governance. Even at its beginning, there is another layer forming. Because the system is not only about controlling people's actions, it begins to move toward controlling something deeper, belief, direction, and eventually worship. Not always openly, not always immediately, but the movement is there. From guiding people to positioning authority between people and the Most High. And once that begins, the system no longer just organizes life. It begins to replace what was supposed to guide it. This is the first visible form of Babylon, not just rule, but organized control. And at this stage, it is clear. It is direct. It is visible, which is why it is easier to recognize. But as the system continues, that clarity does not remain. It becomes more structured, more refined, more difficult to identify. And what begins here does not stay here. Chapter 5. The formation of Babel. What begins with Nimrod does not remain an idea. It becomes structure. In Genesis 11, at Babel, now the system takes visible form. The people come together. One language, one speech, one direction. And at first that might seem like something good. Unity, agreement, alignment. But then they say something that reveals everything about the nature of what they are building. Let us build. That statement matters more than it appears, because it defines the source of their direction. Not let us follow, not let us obey, not let us seek the Most High. Let us build. What you are seeing in that moment is not just cooperation. It is independence from divine authority. It is humanity establishing structure without submission. And that changes the meaning of unity. Because unity, without obedience to the Most High, is not righteousness. It is alignment under a different authority. the authority of man. This is where Babylon takes form, not just as influence, but as structure, a system where people agree to build together without being guided from above. And as that happens, something deeper begins to take place. Identity begins to shift. Instead of identity coming from covenant, from relationship, from obedience, it begins to come from the system itself, from what is being built, from what people are part of. And when identity is formed that way, the system no longer needs to convince people to stay. They belong to it. This is why Babel is not just a story about a tower. It is a revelation of structure, a structure that is built on agreement instead of obedience, on unity instead of truth. And as that structure develops, it becomes more organized, more efficient, more convincing, because it works. It produces results. It creates something visible. And because it creates something visible, people trust it. But what is being built is not aligned with the Most High. It is aligned with the system. And what begins at Babel does not remain there. It becomes the pattern. Chapter 6. The system enters leadership. As the system develops, it does not remain external. It does not stay outside of the people. It moves inward, into leadership, into authority, into those who are responsible for guiding others. And this is where the nature of Babylon changes again, because as long as the system exists outside of the people, it can be identified. It can be resisted. It can be seen as something separate. But once it enters leadership, that separation begins to disappear. By the time you reach the prophets, especially in Jeremiah, the warning is no longer focused on an external force. It is focused on shepherds, those who were given responsibility to guide, to teach, to lead people in the right direction. And something has gone wrong. The ones who were meant to gather are now scattering. The ones who were meant to speak truth are now speaking from themselves, from their own authority, their own understanding. And this is what makes the system more dangerous at this stage, because it is no longer operating from the outside. It is operating from within the structure people trust. Leadership becomes the vehicle of the system. Authority becomes the voice of the system. And because people trust leadership, they follow, not realizing that what they are following has already been shaped. This is how Babylon embeds itself, not by forcing people to submit, but by shaping the direction of those they trust. And once that happens, control no longer needs to be applied from the outside. It is maintained from within, through teaching, through guidance, through influence that feels legitimate. And because it feels legitimate, it is rarely questioned. This is why it becomes harder to identify. Because people are no longer looking for something outside of themselves. They are receiving it from within the system they believe is guiding them. And when control is maintained that way, it does not feel like control. It feels like truth. And that is where Babylon becomes far more difficult to recognize. Chapter 7. The system enters what is holy. This becomes even clearer when you reach the account in John chapter 2. Because at this point, the system has already moved. It has gone from structure to leadership. And now it enters something even more sensitive, what people believe is sacred. Yahusha enters the temple, and this is important, because the temple is not just a building. It represents the place where people believe they are closest to the Most High, the place of prayer, the place of connection, the place of reverence. So what he finds there matters, and what he finds reveals how far the system has gone. Inside the temple, there is buying, selling, exchange, money-changing hands, activity that belongs to commerce, operating inside a space meant for worship. And at first it may not seem out of place, because it is structured, organized, functional. It works. But that is exactly the problem, because the system does not always enter through chaos. Sometimes it enters through order, through what appears to be necessary, through what people become accustomed to, until something that does not belong feels like it does. And then Yahusha overturns the tables, not gradually, not quietly. He disrupts it, because what is happening there is not just commerce. It is the system operating inside what was meant to be sacred. Religion and economics have merged. And once they merge, control becomes structured into what people believe is righteousness. This is one of the clearest exposures of Babylon, because it shows that the system is not limited to the outside world. It is not limited to politics. It is not limited to leadership. It can exist inside what people trust the most, inside what they believe is guiding them. And when it reaches that level, it becomes even harder to recognize, because people are no longer questioning what they are seeing. They are accepting it as normal, as necessary, as part of how things are supposed to function. And when something is accepted that way, it is rarely challenged. That is how Babylon sustains itself, not just by entering structure, but by entering what people believe is holy. Chapter 8. The full structure. When you step back, and you stop looking at individual moments, and you begin to look at the pattern as a whole, something becomes clear. Babylon is not random. It is structured. It is built in layers, and each layer serves a purpose. Religion shapes what people believe. It defines what is right, what is required, what must be followed. It establishes a foundation of thought, because once belief is established, everything else can be built on top of it. Then narrative shapes how people see the world. It tells them what is happening, what it means, how to interpret what they experience. So even when people are seeing the same events, they are not understanding them the same way, because perception has been shaped. Then economics determines what people depend on. It defines what they need, what they rely on, what they cannot function without. And once dependence is created, freedom becomes limited, because what people depend on, they will protect, and what they need, they will submit to. Then politics enforces the structure. It takes belief, perception, and dependence, and turns them into law, into policy, into obligation. So now the system is no longer optional. It is structured into daily life, and as long as everything is functioning, as long as people are aligned with the system, force is not necessary. But when something challenges that structure, when belief is questioned, when perception begins to shift, when dependence is disrupted, then force is introduced. This is not the first step. It is the final step, because force is not how the system prefers to operate. Force is what the system uses when everything else fails. And as the system becomes more refined, it needs force less often, because it becomes better at shaping belief, at guiding perception, at creating dependence. Until people are no longer being forced to comply, they are participating. And when participation is achieved, control no longer feels like control. It feels like life. It feels like the way things are supposed to be. And that is the full structure of Babylon. Not just power, but a system that shapes reality itself. Chapter 9. How Babylon moves. Up to this point, the system has been revealed as structure. Something that exists, something that is built, something that organizes and governs. But the system is not static. It moves. And Scripture shows this movement in a way that is very deliberate. In Revelation, the system is not described as a structure alone. It is described in motion, horses moving across the earth, each one representing a function, not separate from the system, but expressions of how it operates. This is where understanding deepens, because what people often see as isolated events are actually connected mechanisms. The red horse, pieces taken, not lost, taken. Conflict begins, division increases, pressure rises. This is not random. It is the system responding. Then comes the black horse. Scarcity is introduced, control over resources, control over what people need, buying, selling, dependence. And when dependence increases, so does submission. Then comes the pale horse. Death, not just physical death, but collapse. Breakdown of what once held structure together. These are not separate moments. They are progression. They are movement. They are how the system responds. When it is challenged, when it expands, when it must reassert control. And this is where people often misunderstand what they are seeing. They see conflict and call it failure. They see scarcity and call it mismanagement. They see collapse and call it coincidence. But when you understand the system, you begin to see something else. You begin to see pattern, because these are not accidents, they are functions. And as these mechanisms operate, the system does not weaken. It adapts. It becomes more complex, more layered, more difficult to trace, because now the system is no longer just structure, it is movement. And when something moves this way, it becomes harder to predict, harder to understand, and easier to misinterpret. But once you recognize the pattern, you are no longer looking at events. You are seeing the system in motion. Chapter 10. The true conflict. Once you begin to see the system clearly, something else begins to come into focus. The conflict in Scripture. And it is not what most people think, because it is often presented as nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, people against people. But when you step back and look at it through the pattern that has been revealed, you begin to see something deeper. This is not simply conflict between groups. It is conflict between systems, two completely different ways of order, two completely different sources of authority. On one side, Israel, not just a people, but a pattern of covenant, relationship with the Most High, obedience, alignment with something higher than man, order that comes from above. On the other side, Babylon, not just a kingdom, but a system, control, structure, authority built by men, order that is created and enforced from within the system itself. And these two are not variations of the same thing. They are opposites, because one requires submission to the Most High, and the other replaces that submission with structure. One restores life through obedience. The other consumes through control. One leads outward toward relationship. The other pulls inward toward dependence on the system. And because of that, they cannot align. They cannot merge. They cannot exist in harmony. But here is where it becomes difficult to recognize. As Babylon develops, it becomes more refined, more embedded, more integrated into everyday life. And as that happens, the difference between the two becomes less obvious to those living inside the system. Because when something surrounds you, shapes your thinking, defines what is normal, you stop comparing it to anything else. And when that comparison disappears, recognition disappears with it. So what Scripture reveals as a clear conflict begins to look like normal life. And that is what makes this conflict so important to understand. Because it is not something happening somewhere else. It is something you are living inside of. Every system you interact with, every structure you depend on, every authority you recognize, exists within this tension. Israel and Babylon, covenant and control, relationship and structure. And once you begin to see that, you realize something that changes everything. You are not just observing this conflict, you are inside of it. Chapter 11. The final form. Mystery Babylon. Scripture does not only describe Babylon in the past, it describes a final form, a form that is not as easy to recognize. And that difference matters. Because when you look at Nimrod's Babylon, or the kingdom under Nebuchadnezzar, the system is visible, authority is direct, power is obvious, control is declared, oppression is not hidden. It is enforced. You know who rules. You know who is in power. There is no confusion about where authority comes from. But Scripture points to something different, a form of Babylon that is described as a mystery, not because it does not exist, but because it is not easily seen. This is where the system changes. It does not disappear. It refines itself. Mystery Babylon does not operate through visibility alone. It operates through layers, through systems, through narratives, through structures that people participate in, without fully understanding how they work. Where ancient Babylon demanded obedience, Mystery Babylon creates conditions that produce compliance. Where ancient Babylon used chains, Mystery Babylon uses systems. Where ancient Babylon ruled openly, Mystery Babylon operates through what appears to be normal life. And that is what makes it dangerous, because what is obvious can be resisted. But what feels normal is rarely questioned. And from the very beginning, Babylon was never only political. It was also spiritual. Nimrod is not only presented as a ruler, but as a figure that begins to move authority into a place that does not belong to man. The system is not only about organizing people, it is about directing worship, about positioning authority between the people and the Most High. And that pattern does not disappear, it repeats. Rulers begin to take on roles that go beyond governance. Figures like Xerxes are elevated beyond kingship into divine representation. In Rome, leaders such as Julius Caesar hold both political authority and high priesthood. Governance and spiritual control become one. The system is no longer just ruling people. It is positioning itself as the authority they look to. And as the system develops into its final form, that pattern does not disappear. It becomes more refined, less visible, more embedded, until authority no longer needs to be declared. It is assumed. And one of the clearest places this refinement can be seen is in the structure of economy itself, not just trade, but the systems that govern it. Cycles of expansion and contraction, periods of growth followed by loss, inflation, deflation. These are presented as natural, as scientific, as necessary. But when you look closely, they create pressure, they extract, they shift resources, often in ways that are not obvious to those living within them. And this is what makes it a mystery. The system is not only operating, it is being explained in a way that makes it appear neutral. But underneath that explanation, the function remains the same: control, extraction, dependence. And Scripture reveals something even deeper: that this system does not operate in a single form. It moves between extremes. On one side, control, tight authority, restriction, what can be understood as spiritual Egypt. On the other side, disorder, instability, lack of restraint, what is compared to Sodom. Two extremes that appear to oppose each other. But when you step back, they do not cancel each other out. They serve the same system. And when a system can operate in both control and chaos, it no longer depends on balance. It controls the outcome. And that is Mystery Babylon. Chapter 12. The Nature of Control. Once you understand how Mystery Babylon operates, something else begins to come into focus. Not just what the system is, but how it sustains itself. Because when a system can operate in both extremes, it no longer depends on stability. And that is something most people overlook, because people are taught to believe that systems require balance, that order must be maintained, that chaos is a failure, that instability is a breakdown of control. But when you examine Babylon closely, you begin to see something very different. This system is not designed to avoid chaos. It is designed to survive it. And more than that, it is designed to use it. If control tightens, the system remains. If control loosens, the system still remains. If there is order, it governs. If there is confusion, it adapts. Because the system is not dependent on conditions. It is built to function in all of them. And that is what makes it so difficult to recognize. Because people think they are moving between opposites, when in reality, they are moving within the same structure. From restriction to release, from stability to instability, from control to chaos. But the system remains intact through all of it, and when that begins to settle in, something becomes clear. The goal of Babylon is not to create peace. It is to maintain power, even if that power must be sustained through cycles of pressure, cycles of loss, cycles of uncertainty, because pressure produces movement, and movement, when it is guided by the system, produces compliance. People adjust, they respond, they adapt to conditions without ever stepping outside of the structure that created those conditions. And this is why the system can allow instability, because instability does not break it. It redirects people back into it. It increases dependence. It limits options. It narrows direction until movement itself is guided by the system. And once movement is guided, control no longer needs to be forced. It is sustained, and that is why instability does not weaken Babylon. It feeds it. And anything that feeds a system like this will eventually bring it to a point where it can no longer sustain itself. Chapter 13. The Collapse. But there is a limit to what a system like this can sustain, because while it is designed to function through extremes, it is not designed for unity, and that matters. Because unity requires something higher than power, something that holds structure together, something that establishes order beyond competition. But in Babylon, power is the foundation, and when power is the foundation, there is no higher authority to hold it in place. So what begins to happen is not immediate destruction, it is tension, pressure building within the system itself. Power begins to compete with power. Structures that once worked together begin to move against each other. Authority challenges authority, not from the outside, but from within, because every part of the system is built on the same principle, control. And when control is the goal, it does not remain shared. It becomes contested. This is why Scripture describes this pattern repeatedly. Kingdom rising against kingdom. Authority challenging authority. Division increasing, not because the system is being attacked, but because it cannot sustain agreement within itself. And as that tension builds, the system begins to turn inward. It consumes itself. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but in stages. Pressure builds, fractures form, control weakens in one place, only to tighten in another. Stability begins to break down, even as the system attempts to hold itself together, and the more it tightens, the more pressure it creates, until eventually the system reaches a point where it can no longer sustain its own structure. Not because it lacks power, but because it cannot unify it. This is the collapse, not sudden, but inevitable, because what is built on control cannot hold forever, and when collapse begins, it does not resolve the system, it exposes it. And what is exposed is no longer hidden, and once it is no longer hidden, something else must follow. Chapter 14. The Judgment. But collapse is not the end of the story, because if collapse were the end, then Babylon would simply be replaced, one system falling, another system rising, the pattern repeating itself again. But Scripture does not describe replacement, it describes judgment, and that is something very different, because judgment is not about repairing what was broken. It is not about stabilizing what collapsed. It is not about improving the system. Judgment is about exposing it, bringing it into the light, revealing what it truly is. Everything that was hidden becomes visible. Everything that operated in mystery is revealed. Everything that appeared to be one thing is shown for what it actually is. And once it is revealed, it cannot continue, because the system does not survive exposure. It depends on it being misunderstood. It depends on it being accepted. It depends on it being seen as normal. But when that is removed, the system loses its foundation, and that is when the authority that Babylon attempted to replace returns, not as an idea, not as a concept, but as authority. The authority that was always above the system, the authority that the system tried to imitate, the authority that it tried to stand in place of. And when that authority returns, there is no negotiation, there is no adjustment, there is no reform, because what was built was never aligned to begin with. It was built in opposition. From the beginning, from Nimrod to Babel to every system that followed, and what is built in opposition cannot be corrected. It cannot be aligned. It cannot be restored. It must be removed, not slowly, not partially, but completely. This is not the correction of Babylon. This is the end of it. And once judgment begins, there is no return to what was before, only what comes after. Chapter 15. The Revelation. Now the pattern is complete, not just explained, but revealed. Because once you have seen it from the beginning, you cannot look at it the same way again. Babylon begins as structure, something that is built, something that organizes, something that establishes control. Then it expands into system, something that no longer exists in one place, but operates across everything. It embeds itself into belief, into perception, into dependence, until it is no longer something people interact with. It becomes something they live within. And as it develops, it refines itself, becoming less visible, more integrated into everyday life, more difficult to recognize. It moves through force when it must, but it prefers influence, because influence produces participation, And participation sustains control. It divides through extremes, maintaining power, whether through order or chaos. And as those extremes continue, pressure begins to build, not outside the system, but within it. Until that pressure begins to fracture the structure itself. It collapses, not because it is defeated externally, but because it cannot sustain what it created. And then, it is judged, not reformed, not corrected, ended. And once you see that pattern, something changes. Because now you are no longer reading scripture the way you did before. You begin to recognize what is being described, not as isolated events, but as a system that has existed in different forms across different times, a system that has adapted, refined, continued, and now exists in its most developed state. So Babylon is not something you are waiting for. It is not something that is coming in the future. Babylon is already here, and scripture says it will remain until it is judged. And once you understand that, you are no longer asking where Babylon is. You are asking, where am I in relation to it? Closing. So this is no longer just about history. It is not just about kingdoms that rose and fell. It is about a system that has been operating the entire time. A system that people live within, participate in, depend on, often without ever questioning it. You are not just reading about Babylon. You are living in a system that scripture already described. And the question is not whether it exists. The question is, do you recognize it? Because once you recognize it, you begin to see it everywhere. In structure, in leadership, in systems, in patterns that repeat themselves again and again. And when you see it, you are no longer looking at the world the same way. You are no longer asking what is happening. You are asking why. And once you begin asking that, you are no longer passive. You are aware. The ministry is the walk. Remember, brother and sisters, our Father blesses motion and obedience to His word. Get it in you. Live it. Shalom.